Romans 1:18-20 says this: "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known by God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, His divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." In other words, what Scripture is saying there is that whether we grew up knowing about Jesus or not, God has made the awareness of His presence known. And so anybody is aware of that. And so the issue really is people are punished and judged when we talk about the end based on their wickedness and sin, is what that says, not based on their rejection of Jesus. Jesus provides a solution for an impossible way of getting out of our sin. And so that's what Jesus does. And if they reject Jesus, then they take on their own sin, and there's no Jesus doesn't take it on their behalf, and so they take it on. But the issue here and the question is, well, what if they don't know about Him? How do they take it on? And we don't really know. We do know in Scripture, based on the Old Testament, it's possible that God gives them a knowledge of His presence and they believe. So in other words, Paul says in Romans 4, Abraham, who obviously didn't know Jesus at the time, he says, was justified not by works. In other words, he didn't do a certain thing and therefore God saved him. But he says he was justified by faith. In other words, it says he believed in God and it credited to him as righteousness. If you hear stories of missionaries, oftentimes you'll hear the stories. They will go into a village who've never heard the gospel, and yet in their own practices there is often a scapegoat kind of a thing, or where there's a sin of the village is being put on an animal who's sent out away from the village or banished. Some of them it's a person who's sent out away. I mean, there's a practice that shares a little bit of what the story's all about. So they're very possible that God is working in them. But to really answer that question, we don't know. We do know, though, of course, those who are faced with the gospel, then the question is very clear. When Jesus is offered to them and it's rejected, then they take on their own punishment, their own sin. There's also a couple questions. How can we be sure about going to heaven? In other words, here's the question. If we believe in Jesus when we just take it for granted that... if we believe in Jesus, can we just take it for granted that we'll make it to heaven when we die? What happens if we believe in Him but don't really live an active Christian life? Will we still go to heaven? Another question related to that is it normal as a Christian to sometimes have doubts about the whole God-heaven thing? I know that we go to heaven if we believe, but I'm still petrified of dying because I don't know for sure. Or does that just mean my faith is very weak? The answer to these two questions, I think, lie in the understanding of what it means to believe and what it means to have faith. Hebrews 11:1 says this: "Faith is being sure of what we hope for and is certain of what we do not see." So in other words, there's a story, for example, in Mark 9 of a father with a demon-possessed son who goes to Jesus and he says, I know that you can. Will you heal my son? Or could you heal my son? And he says, well, do you believe? And he says, I do believe. Help me with my unbelief. And then Jesus heals his son. Well, in that situation, he had a belief, and yet there was a lot of doubt. He was uncertain. And yet he had a faith that was, but it was okay to doubt in that story. But I can tell you this. If they would have carried that story on, I could promise you that if someone asked to him and says, do you still think Jesus could heal? It would be without a doubt. There was no longer doubt in his mind. Because he experienced for himself where his faith became evident in the practice of his own life and the experiences of his own life. And so in that question, there's this idea that there can be doubt in our life, but the more that we practice our faith and the more we experience our faith in the presence of God, the more that we move from doubt to confidence. And which kind of leads to the part of that first question. Can we believe yet and not live? Which, what I just got done saying, it's the living part that validates and strengthens our own faith. And so I would say that it's like an example if I grabbed this chair over here and said, I believe that chair will hold me, and yet I refuse to sit down in it. I mean, there's a point where you're going to think, well, I don't think he really believes it, because he's not willing to do it. On the flip side of what I just said, I can say that I believe in it and have doubt. After I sit in it, I'm confident it will. I mean, I say that a lot of times when I get on a ladder. I think it'll hold me, and it's only after I go up on it I realize, oh, okay, it can, That's where that process of experience, when we live it out, begins to validate our faith. James wrote in James 2:17, faith without deeds is dead. That faith alone without action really isn't faith at all. To say I believe and yet not let that transform and change you really is to say, do I even believe, or am I just giving lip service to it? Jesus says in the Bible, in Matthew 7, I think, where people say, Lord, Lord, I did things for you. And yet he says, I don't even know you. Because there was a verbal expression of faith and belief, but yet there was not any transformation that takes place. Belief based on faith brings about change. If you truly believe, you cannot stay where you are. It is impossible to be able to do that, because belief based on faith brings about change in your own life. Jesus said to his disciples, if you obey me, or if you believe, you will obey and bear fruit. It's just a given. It will happen. Like a tree, like an apple tree will bear apples, you will bear fruit. It's not an option. It's a natural process of seeing God working in our life. And as we bear fruit, and as we change, and as we allow God to transform us in our life, our faith grows and becomes stronger and becomes real. And as our faith grows, our doubt about what we believe fades away. And so to the questions that we had is, you have to be able to live the life not out of an obligation of doing a work, but rather it's a natural process of the faith you have. So Paul says, for example, in Colossians 1, he says, to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. He's not talking about works. He's talking about we believe by faith, but live it out so that as you see the transformation taking place, it confirms in you the faith that you have and the fact that God is in you. And you can speak with confidence that I know I believe, so I know heaven is real, because God speaks of heaven. I don't have to doubt it. I don't have to fear death, because I'm confident about my faith, because I didn't do this on my own. God is working in me, and He's transforming me. So I'm adding to stuff, and I should be subtracting. So I got to put our clock isn't working. I better put it out here just to make sure. Oh, wait a minute, that's a compass. That's not going to help us, is it? Okay, so let me move from that. We got to keep moving here. So the next questions are about moments about the whole going to heaven thing. How do we move from here to there? What happens? And here's the questions that I had. There's a couple of them. One is, what's the rapture exactly? Now, we got a few minutes. I could probably deal with that. It's bigger than that. But anyway, when our bodies go to heaven, can we have God change it to more? I love this question. When our body goes to heaven, can we have God change it to be more like we want it to look before we go? Who around here has been ordering those magazines about, those health magazines? When we die before we go to heaven at the same exact time, do we have to wait for the second coming before we go to heaven? And then another question is, are our family members in heaven now or still on the earth waiting to be raptured? And the question sounds like it's implying to really 1 Thessalonians 4:17, which is where that idea of rapture. Rapture literally means caught up. And in that passage in 1 Thessalonians I talked about, it talks about the coming of Jesus and how the trumpets and all that, and as He's descending, that those that are dead will rise and come to meet Him, and those that are alive will come up to meet Him, be caught up in heaven as well, as if a kind of a welcoming party. If you think of the story of Jerusalem, when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday kind of a thing, well, the second coming is like, the believers come in and welcome Him back in the coming second coming. And the whole rapture thing, of course, has a lot of differences. I mean, is there going to be 7 years of this, and is there going to be 1,000 years of that, and all that other stuff, and that's another subject. But one thing you know for sure, Jesus will come again. And when He comes again, that's it. And it's judgment on that time. So for today, just focusing on what He said, is I really want to focus on more of the question of where do we go when we die. There are plenty of passages that tell us that we go to meet Jesus, that we go right away to be able to see Him. I know, like in the case of the Catholic Church and others, there's a doctrine of purgatory and stuff, but honestly, Scripture itself, there's no evidence to that. They'll be able to say that. In fact, it goes against the whole issue of that is Jesus' death and resurrection enough, all that I need to be able to save. In other words, I have to go somewhere else and get purified. Doesn't really fit within that theology, if you will. But that aside, Scripture itself speaks plenty about it. Ecclesiastes 12:7 says, dust returns to the ground and the spirit returns to God. Luke 23:43 is when Jesus on the cross, and the thief acknowledges Him. He says, today you will be with me in prayer. Today you'll be with... See, my head is moving faster than my mouth. Today you'll be with me in paradise.